A single decision has just shaken Canada's liquor shelves, and it wasn't made in Washington. It was made in Ontario. Overnight, American wines and spirits vanished from the LCBO, one of the world's largest alcohol buyers. More than 3,600 products, from Kentucky bourbon to California reds, were stripped away. The reason? A bold strike against U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and forestry products. But here's the twist. Instead of hurting Washington, the move might be hurting Canadians themselves, and the question now is simple. Who's really paying the price? Let's rewind. The United States imposed heavy tariffs on Canadian metals and wood, sending shockwaves through key industries. Ottawa's response was slow, fragmented, and critics say, unclear. That's when Ontario Premier Doug Ford stepped in, announcing a sweeping ban on U.S. alcohol in provincial stores. His message was clear. No deal, no booze. At first glance, the gamble seemed to work. Canadian wine sales jumped more than 60% in Ontario, and some local producers celebrated. For a brief moment, it looked like a patriotic win. But beneath the headlines, cracks were already forming, because other provinces weren't playing along. Quebec and Saskatchewan quietly restocked. Us brands Alberta never fully joined, and that lack of national unity created a dangerous split. While Ontario dug in, the rest of Canada signaled to Washington, business as usual. Here's where the tension rises. If Ontario stood alone, could the ban even work, or was it doomed to backfire from the very beginning? Stay with me, because what comes next shows how a symbolic boycott spiraled into a full-scale economic headache. And the fallout isn't just about liquor. It's about jobs, supply chains, and the future of Canada's trade leverage. The shelves told the story first. Where bottles of American whiskey and bourbon once lined LCBO aisles, there were sudden gaps, empty rows that frustrated loyal customers. Shoppers who reached for their go-to brands were left with two options: switch to something else, or walk away entirely. For a while, some did switch. Canadian labels like Corby Spirit and Wine reported short-term gains. Local wineries smiled at the spike in sales, but those numbers came with a warning. Surges built on boycotts rarely last, and when the novelty wears off, consumers don't just pivot. Many stop buying altogether. That's exactly what began to unfold. Spirits Canada reported nationwide sales dropping nearly 13%. Not just U.S. brands, but Canadian hospitality chains, bar owners, and wholesalers suddenly felt the squeeze. Bars in Toronto and Ottawa cut hours. Restaurants trimmed cocktail menus. Job cuts followed quietly, week by week. And the expiration clock started ticking. Some American stock already pulled from shelves sat in warehouses, inching toward expiry dates. Liquor isn't milk, but even premium wine and whiskey have limits. If bottles are dumped, it won't just waste inventory, it will slash provincial revenues when budgets are already strained. Meanwhile, border towns faced their own disaster. With shelves bare, cross-border shopping trips plunged. At some land crossings, trips dropped by almost a third. For small towns built on weekend visitors, that wasn't inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Duty-free shops saw sales collapse by as much as 80%. Parking lots once packed with Friday night cars sat empty. The irony. While Ontario was bleeding, U.S. distillers barely flinched. With 49 other states and booming exports to Asia and Europe, they didn't need Ontario. But Ontario businesses, they needed those imports. The imbalance was clear. But what made it worse was that Canada's own provinces weren't speaking with one voice. And that fracture gave Washington exactly the opening it wanted. While Ontario was scrambling to justify its liquor ban, the United States played a very different game. Instead of reacting with panic, U.S. distillers doubled down. The Distilled Spirits Council issued a blunt statement. Canada's move wasn't hurting them, it was hurting Canadians. And behind the scenes, producers were already repositioning shipments. Kentucky bourbon found new homes in Europe. California wineries rerouted crates to South Korea and Japan. Maryland craft distilleries targeted Asia. In other words, Ontario closed one door, and the U.S. opened 5 more. The bigger problem, Ottawa wasn't ready. While provinces made patchwork decisions, Saskatchewan banning some American-owned labels one week, then reversing course the next. Washington saw weakness. A fractured Canada meant no unified pressure. Instead of cornering the U.S., Canada cornered itself. Ontario stood firm, but it was isolated. Saskatchewan quietly admitted it had miscalculated. Alberta returned to business as usual. Quebec avoided the fight altogether. The result? American products trickled back into Canadian stores outside Ontario. That sent a clear message to Washington. This wasn't a national strategy. It was one premier, acting alone. And in trade wars, division is the enemy of leverage. Meanwhile, Ottawa's statements sounded more like confusion than coordination. Talk of studying the impact and exploring options did little to calm retailers or reassure businesses. For Canadian importers, it created paralysis. Orders were delayed. Shipments were canceled. Distributors couldn't plan for the next quarter, let alone the next year. And every delay in Ottawa only strengthened Washington's hand. Because the longer Canada argued with itself, the clearer it became. U.S. producers had time, options, and global buyers. Canada, it had empty shelves and frustrated consumers. But the consequences didn't stop at liquor aisles. The tariffs were spilling into deeper industries, aluminum, auto parts, even agriculture. And the lesson Washington was learning from Ontario's boycott would shape the next stage of the fight. The liquor boycott was supposed to be symbolic. but symbols have consequences. When the LCBO yanked thousands of American products, the shock went far beyond the wine aisle. Supply chains across Canada started to wobble. Restaurants in Toronto and Ottawa complained about price hikes. Importers warned they couldn't plan shipments because policies kept flipping back and forth. That kind of uncertainty doesn't hurt the U.S., it hurts Canadian businesses. Then came aluminum. With tariffs slapped on cans, breweries that relied on U.S. packaging faced brutal math. One Ontario brewer admitted they ordered 50,000 cans at a time, but a 25% duty meant costs skyrocketed. Switching to glass would cost $500,000. Stockpiling pre-tariff cans. Impossible without cash and storage. It's basically just-in-time inventory, one owner said. We're packaging it, getting it out, and praying prices don't crush us. That financial squeeze rippled outward. Breweries cut hours. Staff were sent home early. Restaurants sold fewer pints. Hotel rooms sat half empty. Gas stations pumped less fuel. Tour operators lost bookings. What looked like a liquor dispute was now bleeding into Canada's hospitality and tourism backbone. Across the border, the picture couldn't be more different. US towns thrived. Hotels stayed full. Bars poured, as usual. American producers weren't waiting on Ottawa's coordination meetings. They were shipping globally, filling gaps left by Canada's hesitation. To Washington, this wasn't a setback. It was a gift. And here's the dangerous part. Every day Canada failed to respond with a unified, coordinated strategy. Washington took note. If Ontario couldn't hold the line on liquor, what would happen when the fight moved to auto parts, lumber, or agriculture? Would Canada fold again? That's the cliff Ottawa now faced. A liquor ban meant to show strength was starting to expose weakness, and Washington was preparing for the bigger battles still to come. By the time the dust settled, one thing was clear. The liquor boycott had backfired. American distillers didn't blink. They had global buyers waiting, but Ontario businesses from small liquor shops to border town hotels couldn't adapt as easily. Sales slumped. Jobs disappeared. Revenues drained away. And what was meant to be a bold message to Washington became, in reality, a costly self-inflicted wound. Premier Doug Ford had warned the booze wouldn't return until tariffs disappeared or a new deal was struck. But months later, there was no deal, no relief, and no sign Ottawa had a plan. Each day the shelves stayed empty. Ontario looked more isolated, not stronger. For the U.S., the lesson was simple. Canada's fragmented response proved that Ottawa struggled to mount a united front. That weakness gave Washington confidence to push harder, not just on liquor, but on bigger trade fronts, auto parts, forestry, and agriculture. If Canada folded on alcohol, what would stop it from folding elsewhere? And here lies the deeper question. Was the boycott ever about pressuring Washington, or was it about signaling strength at home? Because while Canadian wine had a brief moment in the spotlight, the bigger picture told a different story, one where Canada's leverage shrank while U.S. influence grew. For everyday Canadians, the impact wasn't abstract. It showed up in higher prices at the bar, in favorite bottles missing from shelves, in border towns losing their weekend lifeline, and in jobs quietly slipping away. So where does Canada go from here? Can Ottawa rally the provinces into one voice before the next trade war escalates? Or has the signal already been sent that Washington sets the rules, while Canada reacts? That's the real cliffhanger, and it won't be solved in the liquor aisle.